Hey folks, this is Lens, also known as Audible Agent, and today I am going to follow up on my promise to do a deep dive of the EVVA ICS lock. It's a lock I just picked yesterday. It's ranked as a black belt lock by LPU, and I had a lot of learnings that I wanted to share about this lock, so that's what this video is going to be about. So I'm going to split this video up into a few different sections. We're going to do an overview of the lock itself. We're going to talk about learning to pick this lock, tools, talk about some of the problems I had, and I'll have some final thoughts at the end. So to start, let me just reintroduce you to the key. The key can be flipped to either side to open the lock. And you'll notice there are some cutouts along the side. Those are what manipulate the levers. So there are 5 levers on the left and 5 levers on the right side of the lock that need to be raised to the correct height in order to get the open. And in addition to that, on the top of the key, you have some cutouts that interact with 3 standard pin tumbler arrangements there. And when I say standard, that's not entirely true because these pins are a little bit odd. Let's see if I can get you a good close-up view of this. The bottom of the pin, where your pick is going to interact with, has a little fin. And that fin will either be on the left side of the lock, the right side, or the center. And that corresponds with, just set this down, with what side of the top of the key the notch is. And so those are interesting. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a bit, but just wanted to give you a quick view of that. Let's take a look at the side pins, or the levers, I guess, the finger pins. You'll see each one has a deep true gate, and there are also always 2 false gates. These basically are topped off by a spring, and so they're always under some sort of spring tension, and the sidebar needs to fall into the true gate before you can get the open, and that has to happen for all of the finger pins on each side. So there's a sidebar on the left, sidebar on the right. All 5 finger pins on each side need to be in the right position before the sidebar can engage. Let's take a look at the plug. So here we're looking top down on the plug. This is the front of the lock. And these first 3 holes are for the pin tumbler. You'll notice there are actually 5. Number 4 and 5 are not populated in this lock. I don't know if there's a variant of this where they are populated, but just know that it's these top 3 that are populated. And you can also see some kind of rectangular notches along the outside. And that is where the channel for which the finger pins slide up and down inside. If we take a look at one of the sides of the lock, this is where the sidebar would fit in. And let's see if I can show you a close-up of the sidebar. See those little fins on the sidebar? There's 5 of them. Those are what are trying to fit into the true gate of the finger pins. So those sliders move up and down, and either the true gate or the false gate is exposed to the sidebar. And again, there's a sidebar on each side of this. Let's also take a look at this keyway. You can see you have some warding right there in the middle. Outside of that, it's pretty open. However, that does not mean it's easy to access the finger pins. The top pins are pretty easy to access, but those finger pins on the side, I would say, are difficult for me to access. When you have the lock fully populated with all of the finger pins, you can probably see little channels on the left side and on the right side. That's where those finger pins are riding up and down. from this perspective, the only thing you can see and really the only thing you can interact with is a tiny little nub on the finger pin. And that is what rides on the grooves of the key to raise and lower those finger pins to the right position. So what this means is that you have to reach around the warding of each one of those channels to reach that little nub and move that pin up to its right location. Let's talk a little bit about stages of picking this, and this is the other side of this dual-sided EVVA ICS lock. To pick this, you can pick it either clockwise or counterclockwise. It doesn't really matter. Let's say you're going counterclockwise, which is what I did in my video. The first stage of attack is going to be the top pins, and they're just standard pins, so other than there being a really thin fin, which kind of gets in the way of your pick, you really just pick those like normal, and they're very easy to set. And you know they're set, and you know you're done with that top section when you get your first false set. You'll further know that you're past that once the finger pins on the side start binding. So at that point, once you've knocked out the top, you're then focused only on the left side. And the philosophy around picking this is that you should hunt for the binding finger pin, raise it up one notch, move on, find the next one, raise it up one notch, and eventually you'll get the pins to the true gate, and you can do the jiggle test. You know, that true gate has a little bit more room to move. So that's supposed to be the indicator that, you know, you've got it in the right gate. Assuming you get all of them into the true gate, you'll get a further deeper false set. And you may get smaller false sets along the way as you get them in the true gates, but you should get a bit of a deeper one once you have the left side, in this case, fully set. And that's your indication that you can move on to the right side and repeat what you did from the left side. And if all goes well, then you've got the lock opened. But it's definitely easier said than done. Okay, let's move on to talking about how I learned to pick this lock. I think the number one challenge starting off with this lock was, how am I going to tension it? And, you know, I usually do my research. I watch a lot of YouTube videos, see what other people are doing, and try to pick the best ideas from different videos for all aspects of picking and incorporate them into my own learning. So the general consensus is that you want to fill up this bottom section with tension bars, tension tools, and you want to make it so that there's very little wiggle room with your tension tools. That way you can float pick, essentially. You have complete control over counter rotation or forward rotation. So in my case, I used this Z-bar to fill up the left side. And I used this other tension wrench, which is also kind of a Z-bar, and I stuck that in the right side. And there's a little bit of wiggle room, but with my left hand, I was able to manipulate the lock rotation in either direction. And I stuck with this for the duration of my learning experience, and it worked pretty well for me. So that is what I would recommend. Let's next talk about navigating this plug to get to the top pins and the side pins. For the top pins, they're again pretty easy. The only thing that makes them weird is that you've got some warding or something going on the top, which makes it hard to find the 3 pins that you are trying to get set. And in addition to that, the little fin that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, sometimes you'll hit it with your pick and sometimes you won't. And it doesn't really matter if you manipulate that pin by being under that fin or if you're kind of more on the body of the pin, you can still get it up into the right location. It just makes the feel of the pick and finding the pins a little bit more difficult. But I'm confident that with, you know, a couple hours of practice, you'll have that down pat and it won't be an issue. A quick side note. A lot of people recommend just going ahead and picking this Euro style, which logically I think could make sense. I'm a North American individual, and so I'm not used to picking that way. However, I did give it a go. I found picking those top pins, which in this orientation would be bottom, was kind of awkward. I think maybe accessing the side finger pins might be a little bit easier. However, it's just not super comfortable for me to, well, one, find the finger pin that way, but also push down without levering against something. So that is not the route I went. I would like to say, though, that I think there is one probably big advantage, potentially, of doing it European style, which is that you have gravity working in your favor when you're trying to manipulate those sliders and keep them from falling out of their set position, which is a notorious problem with this lock. It's called the ping pong problem, which we'll talk more about later. So my first go at manipulating these finger pins was with this hook. And, you don't have a lot of room to work in there, especially when the lock is fully populated with pins. You can kind of feel where each chamber is. That's all fine and good. That helps you with indexing. Getting under the pin was awkward for me, I guess, but I was able to do it on this left side. In fact, I was able to get this lock picked on the left side just using this hook. It was when I went to the right side that I just didn't have the dexterity or the muscle memory to really pull that off. I think I could get there with a lot more practice, but that was where I started to really struggle. And in addition to that, even on the left side, it was difficult to know whether or not I was hitting warding or was actually under a binding pin. And, I quite often would accidentally let my pick go too far up and just be in the totally wrong location for the pin I was trying to pick. So navigation was very, very difficult for me. And in the end, I just felt like the hook wasn't doing me any favors and I needed to go a different route. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I ended up using a, DIY flag pick. If you're going to pick this lock, I really highly suggest learning to pick it in stages. So progressive pinning. If you're trying to pick this lock, you're probably used to picking standard pins, so I don't think you need to worry too much about those top pins. You can focus more on the finger pins on the side. And what I did was I basically isolated my picking strategy at the start to just one side of the lock. So these top pins here are the left side of the lock. And I tried to keep symmetry against the sidebar. So what I mean by that is I started with, say, pins 1 and 5 being the only finger pins in the lock. And you can see that creates a nice symmetry across the sidebar, which I think is important when you're trying to learn to pick this, because if you were to, say, bias it to one side, that sidebar is going to have more pressure on one side than it will on the other, and I think that's going to train you to do the wrong thing. So I would suggest doing what I did. Start off with maybe 2 pins, number 5, number 1. That would really teach you how to get access to that farthest back pin, which is pretty difficult to reach. Maybe from there, switch it up, since these have different gates at different locations. Maybe do something like the middle 3. Or just number 2 and number 4. And then maybe just so you get familiar with how things start to bind in what order, you could do, some combination of that. But the whole point is keep symmetry. I think that's really important to learning how these pins bind and interact with each other without giving you some false understanding that is caused by a bias in the pins being too far one way on the sidebar. Once you get comfortable enough, you can do all pins on one side. And again, I think that's a great way to progressively learn to pick this lock. So for example, I had all 5 pins on the left side populated, and I got very good at picking the lock just with that. And then I did the same thing with just the right side pins. I learned to pick them in small quantities, added more over time, got to the point where I could comfortably pick the right side. And since this lock picks in stages, once you've accomplished that, you're pretty much there. In fact, that's where I realized I was yesterday when I decided I think I could finally pick this open. So at that point, I was able to populate the lock fully, knowing what I knew about the top pins, the left side, and then the right side, I was able to get the open. The philosophy is to pick the binding pin first. I was so familiar with this lock that it got to the point where I didn't even really have to hunt for the binding pin. I just knew kind of which one it should be. But when I did try to do that, I ran into the ping pong problem. And the ping pong problem is that you'll get one pin that's binding set into its true gate, and then another pin will bind. And you'll try to manipulate that pin up to its true gate, and the one that you had previously set falls down. And the reason that happens is due to the pressure on the sidebar maybe being slightly angled when you're manipulating one of the pins, allowing the previously set pin to fall down. However, it's also just due to the really tight tolerances and machining of this lock. So the ping-ponging problem is, again, notorious amongst people who have picked this lock or tried to pick this lock. It is really, really a pain in the ass. And so in the end, I found a different strategy to work around that. But what I learned from other people is that you can try to, basically, instead of moving up one false gate or one notch at a time, try to go ahead and set the pin to its true gate as soon as possible, and then move on to the next binding pin and try to do the same thing for that one. However, I didn't have very much success doing that. Should mention too that this particular lock has 3 zero lift pins, which in theory just means that the finger pins don't need to be lifted at all in order for them to be set. However, that is not always the case. It's sometimes the case, but you're still best off going through once you feel like you've set the ones are not zero lift, and give them just a little nudge, because that might be what it takes to actually get that side of the lock picked. And there's actually an example of that in my video from yesterday. All right, let's talk now about the tools that worked for me and the ones that didn't, and some of the things I've seen on YouTube that other people are using. If you have a look at Artichoke 2000's video on picking this lock, he makes it look so damn easy. And that's probably due to the fact that I'm a less experienced picker and he's a more experienced picker, and he's just really good at what he does. However, I believe, if I remember correctly, he mostly just uses, I think it was an SS Dev hook for both the left side and the right side. And so naturally, seeing how he did it, I tried to go down that same path and quickly ran into a couple issues which I think everybody is going to run into. Number one, so you need to get your pick in, and then you need to start feeling for the different chambers on the left side, right? And what you're feeling for is a little nub on the finger pin that you use to lift or not lift, I guess, the pin that you're trying to focus on. However, the further back you get in this lock, the less room you have to work with, and your hook really gets jammed up. So I tried both a thinner and possibly shallower hook, which got me a little further along, but I still had issues knowing whether or not I was in one of these chambers, had issues with the pick being elevated too high up or too down low, had issues knowing whether or not I was hitting the warding or actually on a pin. And yeah, I mean, I even tried yet another shallower hook. I think this is the one I had the most success with, but still was running into issues. I just had difficulty navigating this lock and knowing where I was. And really, that shouldn't be the case, because, there are grooves in here that you can feel for. And I did kind of get the knack for that, but I think I could get there. I just think it would take a lot more practice. And what really, I guess, caused me to rethink my strategy was when I had to pick the right side. This is a super awkward position for me, being right-handed, trying to get in position, feel for the binder, feel for whether or not I'm even in the chamber, and manipulate that pin up and down. I couldn't do it. I think with more time I could, but I felt like there had to be a better way. And so then I saw other people were using flags, and that seemed really logical to me because the flag can go in, it can hook around that corner, and then, I have experience picking dimple locks. So this kind of rotational motion, which I can do on the left or right side very easily, is much more natural to me. And so like this is a sparrow's flag, which I thought was going to do the trick, but the problem is that the tip of this flag is too wide. It just doesn't fit very well in the chamber to grab onto the pin that you need to focus on. And I went through all of the flags I had, and I even modified one, but it was kind of one of those cheap Chinese flags that isn't round like the sparrow's flags are, and it would bind up against the warding in between the two chambers which sit across from each other. So I started to realize that I was probably gonna have to make something custom, and I went through several iterations. This was the first one, which I have to laugh at now because it's silly to think this was ever going to work. I think this is a 1.2 millimeter thick rod. The profile on the tip is pretty nice. Does a good job of reaching around that corner and lifting the pin up. However, this thing is just too flexible. Wasn't going to cut it. And then on top of that, I have a little bit of leverage here, but not quite the leverage I wanted. I think I then went to one size up. I don't know if this is like 1.3 millimeter or what. A little bit of a wider handle. These are, the handle's just bent from the rod, so it's all one piece, and then I wrapped tape around it. I found that this too just wasn't really getting the job done for me. I needed to go thicker. And so then I started playing with, I think this is 1.6 millimeter rod. And this ended up being the right size for a couple reasons. One, it's rigid enough. Number two, I found that it actually made navigation a little bit easier because this warding right here, those other thinner rod flags that I had created, they would just fall right down that gap. And that would cause me to always have my pick either being too low or just in the wrong vertical location. So what I realized is that if I had a thick enough rod that could rest across that, I could be sure I'm never too low. And then the only challenge is making sure I'm not pivoting up too high away from the pins in the correct location. So this ended up being the right thickness. However, the profile of this tip was not quite right. It was a little too shallow. I needed something just a little bit longer. And so then I redid this pick, different handle, and you can see that the tip of that is just a little bit longer, and this is the one I use to pick on camera. And just to aid in my ability to navigate the lock, you can see I have some depth markers on here. I'll probably do a video just on making this tool because I plan on writing up some specs for it as well. But that was helpful in knowing that I should be roughly in the right location. The only challenge then was just making sure that my pick was parallel to the plug. And because I can rest it on that warding, I can be pretty sure that it is parallel with that plug, which just eliminates one variable that was causing me so much headache. And then at that point, I can sort of just feel for whether or not I'm in that chamber. If I am, the pick will rotate a little more and I should get on that pin. Let me just show you kind of what that looks like real quick. So let's see if you can see it. I don't know if you can see that too well, but I have pin number 3 populated there. And there's a little nub somewhere right around there on that pin. That is what you're trying to reach with your pick. And that's what you're trying to use to mimic the key and lift this pin up. So if I come in from the side, get to chamber number 3, see if I can do this. Not as easy when it's not in the vise. Even then, it's not that easy. Okay, I think I'm there. Maybe. There we go. you can see I can lift that pin up now. And that is kind of in essence what you're trying to accomplish with your tool and interacting with these finger pins. You're trying to reach around this warding and rotate your pick to catch the little nub on the finger pin and lift it up to the right location. Okay, so I've touched on some of the problems that I've run into, but I kind of want to go back over them in detail. So my number one problem in learning to pick this lock was learning to navigate this lock. If you spend most of your time up front, even before picking it, working your way through the core, feeling each chamber with whatever type of pick you decide you want to go with, and feel for the pins, I think you're going to be a lot better off. And keep in mind, you need to do that not only for the left side, but for the right side, which I found to be a bigger challenge. Again, I had to create a custom tool, custom flag, to make this work for me and what I'm experienced doing. However, there are plenty of people out there who swear by the hook and can get the job done just with the hook. That person is not currently me. However, I did it with the flag, so still got the job done. The second biggest issue is the ping-ponging issue that I mentioned. So again, that's where you lift one of the finger pins up to what you think is the true gate. You then work on the next binder, and it causes that first one to fall down. And you can be stuck on a sidebar dealing with that ping-ponging issue for minutes, possibly longer. And it makes picking this lock really, really frustrating. If you watch my video, I'll be the first one to say that my picking style for this lock was, I guess, barbaric, for lack of a better term. I used a lot of force to lift pins up to their true gates and hold them there. And truth be told, that was the only thing I could do to get those pins to stay in their correct location. I tried everything I could possibly do to back off tension as little as possible and prevent the ping-ponging issue. However, I just simply couldn't make it happen. And I felt like I had the right amount of finesse. I'd spend almost a minute backing off my tension just to accomplish that, only for previously set pins to fall back down. So using a little bit more force, a little bit more tension is what did the job for me and allowed me to work around the ping-ponging issue. Another issue that you should just be aware of is these top pins. They can easily fall down early on in the pick. So again, you start by setting these to get into a false set and then work on the finger pins. Just be aware that after you set maybe like the first one or two pins, you should probably go back and just double check those, because you've likely let off some of the tension in order to set those finger pins, and that could have caused these to fall down. And you might be, if you don't do that, you might be stuck like trying to figure out, why don't I have a binder? And that was the issue the whole time. So once you get a little further along in picking a few of the first side of the finger pins, that problem should go away, but just keep that in mind. Periodically go back and touch those pins. Don't be surprised if you see it go back into a false set because one of these dropped. Another issue is very high lift pins. So in this lock, I think it is chamber number 4 on the left side, is a very high lift. That means that this little nub that you're interacting with to lift the pin is out of sight once you get it to the right location. But what that meant for me is that this flag that I created when I'm rotating, it didn't have the reach to get that pin all the way to the top. And I felt like that was true even for some of the lower lift pins. So from time to time, I would go in there with this hook and just try to get that pin up to its final location. And you can see this pick didn't fare so well in my barbaric torture of this EVVA ICS. I'll be replacing that. I mentioned that the rear pins are very hard to reach with the hook. That remains true. Just be aware of that. The first couple pins you can actually just visually see very easily the front of the lock. The further you get back into the core, the less lateral movement you have to manipulate your hook. So, do your best to feel around on the inside of the lock and get an idea of which chamber you're at and where you're at with respect to the pins, but also just be aware that if you're going to practice navigating this lock, maybe spend a little extra time hitting those back pins and getting familiar with interacting with those. Another issue, I mentioned this I think earlier in this video, but also in yesterday's video where I picked this lock, is, quote, zero lift pins. This lock has 3 of them, and just because they are zero lift does not necessarily mean they are truly zero lift. It's often the case that you have to nudge it just a little bit to get the sidebar to go a little bit deeper into the true gate, which it's already resting near, in order to fully get that sidebar recessed into the side of the plug. So that is another thing to be aware of. If you think you've got all the pins set and they feel jiggly and you haven't gotten that next stage of the false set, just double check each pin. And that's honestly something you'll probably end up doing anyway. You'll be going back to previously set pins and just seeing if they need an extra nudge or if they possibly lost their position in their gates. Lastly, in terms of problems, be it with this hook or with my custom flag, I found it really hard, honestly, to get a sensation of whether or not those pins were jiggly and set or were just completely loose. So even though that's kind of the prevailing philosophy in how you know whether or not a pin is set, just be aware that your mileage may vary in terms of your ability to pick up on that sensation. And granted, I am currently ranked a purple belt lock picker. I've been picking locks for 8 years, but I didn't really get into high security locks until a couple months ago. So maybe this is just a thing that you develop a little bit further along the road with more experience with these high security locks. But for me, especially with this DIY flag, which is maybe too long, and maybe that's the issue, I just had a hard time telling, A, was I under the pin, and B, was it jiggly and set, or was it just straight up loose? All right, so let's go through my final thoughts and just kind of summarize everything. This is a difficult lock, but mainly because I feel like the pins are hard to access and the ping-ponging issue is painful. It's doable. I really encourage you to go watch Artichoke 2000's video on picking this, because he just rips right through it like it's no problem, and it's very impressive. And there are a couple other lock pickers out there who similarly have a very easy time navigating this lock. However, that person is not me. You can go for the hooks like most people do. Again, your results may vary, but it's definitely possible. There's plenty of examples of doing it just with hooks out there. So if you're not one who is into making your own custom tools for a job, stick with that. I'm sure you can figure it out. Just know it might get awkward depending on if you're left-handed or right-handed and you're working with the same side. In other words, your wrist is bent at an awkward angle and you're trying to manipulate pins on a side of a lock that just isn't comfortable. Progressive pinning was key for me to get this lock open and learn to understand what the ping-ponging issue really felt like, what it felt like to set pins, what the false sets looked like. And also just, I tore apart this lock and reassembled it so many times that, now reassembling it, even though it has lots of moving parts, is pretty easy. But definitely for learning, this lock, and I would say really any high security lock, break the problem down into small phases, small pieces, and tackle them one at a time. And once you have, each of those problems solved and you're pretty comfortable with your skills, then it's time to try to pick the whole thing. And that is the practice I will continue to follow as I try to learn some of these other high security locks that I'm working on. Again, my pick that I have on video was extremely aggressive, but that worked for me. Worked for me to get around the ping pong issue. The lock is no worse for wear as a result of it. I don't feel great that I had to be so aggressive. I really prefer to have a little bit more finesse in my picking. However, I really wanted to get this lock open, and in the end, I got the job done. And honestly, I'm just happy I did that on camera. I did probably 5 or 6 takes yesterday trying to get this picked on camera once I felt like I had the left side and the right side figured out. Failed to do that. Took a break from being on camera and talking and just focused on what I was doing. And of course I got the open off camera. So then went ahead, tried again on camera, and the result you see is the video I posted yesterday. So I hope that gives you some more clear understanding about this lock and the challenges you may face when you're trying to pick it. I know this is a lot of information, and I tried to break it up into sections, and hopefully this helps somebody out there. And again, with respect to my custom tool, I will be writing up specs for this, and I'll probably do a video even on how to make it, because it's really just a matter of bending some wire and shaping the tip so that it fits between the chambers, moving this way, and inside each chamber to lift the finger pins, and making sure that the length of this tip is correct. So yeah, look for that video at some point in the near future. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap this video up. Thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. And again, I hope this was informative for somebody out there. Bye.